Evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Maxine Most. I'm the principal at Acuity Market Intelligence, and I'm really pleased to be your moderator today for this virtual event, where we're going to be hearing from and engaging with really three leading experts on the current and future challenges of data center security. Today's event is hosted by BioConnect and their platinum sponsors HID, ASSA ABLOY, and Gartner, and we thank them for their sponsorship. Just a few quick housekeeping notes before we begin. This event will run about 45 minutes, including a Q&A opportunity at the end of the dialogue. If you have any questions at any time, you can click on the question icon at the bottom of your screen and submit those as we're going. You don't need to wait till the end. The discussion is being recorded and will be available for replay. So you will receive an email link shortly after we conclude with a link to today's discussion. And finally, we have a very data center sophisticated audience today. So we're going to be jumping right into critical issues at a pretty deep level. If you need more foundational information, there will be a link to BioConnect's new ebook on modern access control in your follow-up email, or you can send an email directly to BioConnect and they'll point you in the right direction. So before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I want to get your response to an instant poll, which asks, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not so much and 5 being hair on fire, how much has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted the way you think about who is accessing your critical systems? And while you are considering that poll, again, I just want to take a few minutes to frame today's discussion. And I think this question is a great launching off point, because I would say that we are all pretty much exhausted by the experience of living in, unprecedented times. And yet, while the impact of COVID has really been inescapable and in some ways really truly devastating, in some ways it's also been kind of amazing. I mean, I doubt that a little over a year ago, any of us would have believed that a global pandemic really would have been the key accelerant for digital transformation. And it's really unlike anything we've ever seen. And yet here we are in a world where the digitization of everything is mainstream and suddenly on the top 3 priority list of every enterprise CEO across the globe, up from 7th or 23rd or 35th from, again, just a little over a year ago. So along with this massive turn to digital first, last and everything in between, I think, we're seeing the associated increase in data volume that enterprises have to rely on, as well as the expectations of the speed and reliability of data access. And of course, to protect this increasingly valuable data, the elevation of cybersecurity, which has become, a business critical enabling capability. I think it always has been, but I don't think we've seen it as the key focus, at the C-level suite in enterprises. But when your world of customers and partners and suppliers is totally virtual and your employees are now working from home, you quite understandably shift your attention from who's got a card key to who's accessing your critical systems. And so the thing that's interesting is there's really kind of a funny twist to this whole shift to cyber, which is that this enterprise appetite for secure data storage and management and access is becoming clearly more insatiable. But as that happens, it's not just the digital security that becomes mission critical, but the physical security of the digital infrastructure. And here we are. Welcome to the world of data center security. So do you agree? Let's take a look at the poll results. Pretty much, we're seeing, a good, 20% have it rated 4 or 5, 15 are sort of in the middle. So we've got a pretty strong, 20 to 30% who see it as that it's the COVID has changed the way they're thinking about critical systems. Okay, so, and with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're really fortunate today to have 3 industry thought leaders that each bring a unique perspective to understanding data center security. And the first is David Cappuccio. He is a distinguished vice president and chief of data center research at Gartner. And simply put, David is Gartner's premier thought leader on emerging trends in intelligent data centers. And we're going to hear from him in just a minute to get an update on his view of the marketplace and how it's evolving as a starting point for our discussion. We also have Kevin Brown. Kevin's the Senior Vice President of EcoStruxure Solutions in the Secure Power Division at Schneider Electric. It's a very impressive title. And it basically means that Kevin has a unique understanding of both the complexity and the challenges of delivering on the physical infrastructure and operations side of data centers. And finally, we have Courtney Gibson. He's the CTO and CISO at BioConnect. Courtney's unique perspective really on the challenges of data center security come from his career-long passion applying disruptive technology to solving difficult problems, something that the two of us share in common, and which in his role at BioConnect means building innovative biometric solutions to keep both the physical and digital infrastructures of enterprises safe. So I think we have, a fantastic, really insightful group of gentlemen here today who all got the memo on button-down blue shirts. And before we launch into our panel discussion, as I mentioned, David's going to share some of his insight into the evolution of data center infrastructure. So David, please take it away.
Thank you, Maxine. I appreciate it. Slide, please. There you go. There you go. Back up one. There we go. Okay. Now we can go to the next slide. Well, actually, what I'm going to talk about here is what I'm hearing from the marketplace. I've been in the data center business for a long time, 40 plus years, at Gartner 28 years. And traditionally, this is what we had. Most people who own data centers, in their mind, they knew what was going on. The rest of the country, the rest of the business, not so much. So IT was all about control. We wanted to control everything. And if we did that, we controlled our destiny, basically, and all was good in the world. That was the last, I say, the first 40 or 45 years of data centers. About 10 years ago, things started to shift. Next slide, please. Without us knowing it, this is what happened. We lost control. And we lost control in many cases because we weren't paying attention to the business. Oftentimes IT was so into control, so into deciding who would get what and what we deploy when and what technology we used and what vendors we used, that we ignored the business, and they went beyond us and did what they wanted to do because frankly, they're trying to solve a business problem. They couldn't wait for IT. So they started deploying their own workloads, their own little solutions. And this conglomeration of connections and applications and services began to evolve, much of which was out of the control of IT. So we essentially inherited this mesh environment that our business units in many cases drove. And it turns out in many cases they drove for the right reasons. They just couldn't wait for IT to catch up. So the real question becomes, how do we get control of this? Next slide, please. What we're beginning to see is this. Most IT shops have finally realized that they can't control everything. And frankly, they shouldn't. It's not about the infrastructure so much. It's about the workloads. What workloads do we need to deliver to the business? For what reasons? And what's the best way to deliver those workloads to reduce complexity, to allow the business to do things as fast as possible, and potentially to do it anywhere I need to do it. Essentially, the future of the world is the infrastructure is everywhere. It's not in my data center. It's not in the cloud. It's not at the edge. It's wherever it needs to be to support the business. So the real question becomes, how do I deploy and create an infrastructure that'll support this kind of model? We call it nodes in a mesh. Essentially, if you have a mesh, how do you deploy these nodes in such a way that when I need to deploy a workload anywhere in the world for any reason, whether it be security or GDPR or customer intimacy or pick a buzzword, can I develop an environment, or do I have an environment I've created where I can deploy that workload quickly to that node in that mesh? Now, intellectually, this is a model that many companies say, yeah, it makes sense. When you get to the next level and the third level, you start to realize the biggest problem here is it's a complex environment, number one, and potentially there's a lot of entry points. So security becomes one of the critical issues. How do I secure this environment? How do I manage it? And not how do I secure it necessarily on-prem, but how do I secure it no matter where it is remotely as well as on-prem? So it becomes a very complex environment, which IT is now responsible for. And that's where the world we starting to see from a lot of very large enterprises, especially multinationals. And the questions they're asking are all around, how do I create it? How do I deploy it? Who do I partner with? And how do I secure it? And that's where we're sitting today. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Maxine.
Thanks, David. That sets the stage really nicely for our discussion. So I'll start with questions with David, in reference to that evolution that we're seeing in the complexity and the questions and challenges that enterprises are facing. So I'm a customer that's made the decision to move from my current internal data center to a colo because I'm overwhelmed with the prospect of managing data everywhere all the time. And what are my expectations relative to provider security? What standards do I need to consider kind of non-negotiable, or does the colo need to consider non-negotiable in delivering to a customer that's making that transition?
I think in most cases that the questions I'm getting asked from companies that are going to colo is two things. I need to make sure that the environment is operationally as robust as possible, so there's no potential for failure. They can live up to their 99.999 availability goals. But secondly, I'm not going to have anybody on-prem. In fact, COVID has driven this in a lot of cases. I get people calling and saying, my issue is not who the partner with. My issue is who's in that partner's environment. I was talking to a company about 6 months ago who said they had sent out a technician to do an upgrade to one of their network switches, and then he went to a second site. They were linked together, active, and did an upgrade to those switches. And then the next day, sadly, he got diagnosed as positive, and they had to quarantine all the sites. And suddenly they had multiple data centers with nobody in them. And this question becomes, how do I avoid that in the future? So when I'm partnering with these companies, from a security point of view and even from a compliance point of view with health regulations, how do they play into this thing, and how do I track those things, and how do I audit what's going on? So I guess one of the big things I'm starting to get people asking is, from a security point of view, how do I know who's in the building and who has access to my cage space, even my rack space, even the devices within the racks, and can I control those things remotely? Because I'm not going to be on site, but I still need to have the comfort that somebody's there and I know who's doing the work.
Interesting. So let's take, so that's really interesting in terms of understanding, the virtualization that we're all experiencing. And yet again, it goes back to this need. There's physical infrastructure, and we still need to manage that in this world where, everything cannot be done remotely, and some things actually require human intervention. So if I'm a customer that's made the decision to move my current, I'm sorry. So let's take a step back. If I'm a customer that's made this decision to move to colo, what's driving that decision? Why are customers, what's really pushing them? You've talked about that a little bit in terms of sort of this need for IT everywhere exploding. But what are the key drivers really, in terms of executive level analysis, and what's happening in the world of data centers with customers, reassessing their current provider, maybe going to another provider, and what is there for required of data centers to hold on to their current customers and provide the environment that meets all those security needs, so they prevent really seeing high level of churn in turning over from one center to another.
Wow. Okay.
I know it's a lot, right? It's a mouthful, right?
Let me start with the first one. What are the key drivers? It's interesting. At a very high level, the key driver is a key question I get from people on a regular basis. Why am I doing this? I'm not in the data center business. I'm in healthcare. I'm in financial services. I'm in manufacturing. Right. I'm not in data centers. Why am I doing this? Well, historically, it's because we've always done it. So this realization, number one, that we need to find somebody who's got the skill sets to actually manage and maintain a data center properly, because in many cases we haven't. Oftentimes it's driven by financials, because the data center they've got is 30 or 40 years old. It's been upgraded over time, but the next upgrade is going to be a huge financial investment. So that capital spend becomes the decision point to not do it. So that's from I guess from a CFO level what the driver is. From an IT point of view, senior level IT, the real driver is I've got to be able to move things so quickly and do things so quickly that I can't do it myself anymore. So if I can move to the right colo, who's got the right infrastructure, I can then perhaps leverage that infrastructure And a good example is people looking at cloud strategies. They realize everything's not going to the cloud. They also realize that the things that may go to the cloud, it may be years before they get there. So if we went into a colo who's got, say, on-ramps to major cloud providers and multiple carriers coming into the building, and essentially I have choice, when I'm ready to begin moving workloads out to the cloud, I can then leverage that provider's infrastructure rather than putting all the pieces of the puzzle in myself. So it makes IT in many cases more flexible if they pick the right provider. And that flexibility means the business itself gets more agile. They can do things faster. There's a cascade effects of benefits to going into a colo versus doing it yourself.
So they're willing to give up the control for the flexibility, it sounds like, because that to me is really interesting.
But all they're giving up control of in many cases is the infrastructure itself, not the IT piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting. Okay. And so if how, so what's keeping customers in a particular colo, right? I mean, how complicated is it to make the shift? What we traditionally call in marketing is, cost of the cost of shifting your business, right? So are those high? Are those low? What can a data center do to hold on to their customers?
Interesting question, because traditionally when people went to colos, they signed 3-year contracts. And then at the end of year 2, they're looking, can they negotiate a better deal with some other colo? But most IT shops have realized that the biggest pain and the biggest cost is doing that migration from one site to another. It's a very painful process because, frankly, you're still trying to run the business. Right. So doing a migration when a business is running live, it's fraught with risk. So that's one thing. What the providers are starting to realize, the colo providers, is just having cheap floor space is the wrong model. What you really need to do is add on more and more value-added services, essentially the hook. Because if I sign a 3-year contract, if I'm a customer, if I'm the provider of the colo, my job in life is make sure at the end of the 2nd year, they're not thinking about negotiating something else. They're loving the services I've given them, and they're going to sign up for a longer-term contract. So I'm going to layer on other services, network services, security services, lots of new services to allow them the flexibility to use things and essentially make their experience more, I guess, more enjoyable.
So it's customer experience across the board.
It's all about it. It's all about customer experience. Yep.
Interesting. Okay. That's really interesting. So Courtney, I want to ask you a little bit about provisioning access, right? We've talked about the value these colo centers. We've talked about, David just talked about how to, it's really preferable for folks to find a place to stay. So you want to really focus on customer experience so that they'll stick around. What's the best way to provision access in a data center to really make it secure so that the customers feel confident and comfortable staying? What kind of vetting processes should be used? And how do you kind of protect and provision and protect resilient infrastructure in the environment? What's that whole stew like so that the customer has a great experience and they feel safe and secure keeping their data there?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's one of those critical questions you need to get right because it's a foundational piece of building a secure system. And we all need to get it right for a whole bunch of reasons, for security reasons, for uptime reasons, for compliance and privacy reasons. We need to know who's getting access to that infrastructure. So all of our systems start with vetting, and it's about knowing that the right people are getting into the right places for the right reasons. And I think to sort of pick the question apart, I think there's 3 steps to doing that right. The challenge with vetting done right is that the first 2 steps need to be implemented, and the last step needs to be continuously evolved. And I think of those 3 steps, vetting really starts with identity proofing. You need to know who is coming into your facility, and that's the usual check that that we all do in data centers with a driver's license or a passport, right? We need to know who physically is there. Second step is we need authorization, right? Maxine needs to, permit me to get into her spaces inside the data center to access the infrastructure that I need to. And those first steps done right mean that at the end of that, I've got a digital identity and I've got some digital rights that I can claim within that space. But the third step of vetting is where the arms race comes in, and that's really an identity binding. You need to give me, a physical person, some way of coming back later and reclaiming that identity, that digital identity, that digital right. And it's that part that needs to be continuously evolved. And I call it an arms race because that's the area that's full of challenges that in the security space we refer to as negative goals, right? David should not be able to come in and claim my identity. David shouldn't be able to get into my suite or my cage in the server room. And those should not goals are the ones that keep us up at night. And it's because the risks to our business continuously evolve, the risks to our customers continuously evolve. And they evolve because technology advances and, sorry to be picking on David, David learns, right? David learns to clone cards, he learns to capture my PIN, he learns to spoof anti-tailgating technology. You really need a security platform that can support vetting, can support that identity binding, and can embrace new technology faster than your threats can learn. That's one of the first things that keeps me up at night is really trying to figure out how we can build systems that accelerate the rate of tech adoption for our customers so that they can stay ahead of those threats. So I think there's a component of vetting that comes down to really understanding how to keep ahead of the threats that ultimately get brought in to keep that infrastructure safe.
So it sounds like you're saying that really identity is at the core of being able to create a secure access, to create secure access in the data center. Without that, it doesn't really matter whatever you're granting access to, whatever kind of provisioning you're doing. If you don't have a reliable, trusted, secure identity platform, then you can't really make sure the rest of the steps are being secured.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and once you have that, then you can start to build your layered approach. And I think from a data center perspective, you need the provisioning of security around that infrastructure needs to come in at the granularity of customers. And I think increasingly we're seeing customers come into DCs wanting to bring in their own access control technology for their suite or their area, and you need to be able to integrate seamlessly to create joint security, joint identity, joint data in order to really have the flexibility to integrate your customers, integrate their system. And there's tremendous stickiness to the question of what is going to keep a customer in your facility, the ability to allow them to integrate their own access control needs, their own access control technologies potentially in with your system and be able to provide them with value add services around alerting, around security. That gets you integrated in a way that really adds value to your customers, but drives long-term relationships in terms of stickiness with customer value. If they're
Can we just for a minute talk about what that means for the integration of sort of the physical and the digital realms of security?
Sure. We've had use cases where, we've had data center customers come to us and say, we have customers that are using Duo as a mobile authenticator. We would love them to be able to extend that multi-factor authentication into their suite. Or, we have customers that want to be able to get data extracts or alerting or, information about how their infrastructure is being accessed to maintain their compliance needs. And the ability to build data integrations, the ability to allow customers to bring tools in and use them as part of an integrated security platform, those are seen by end users as tremendously valuable. And they build longer term relationships between the data center and their end customers.
And how do you link that to, biometrics, which is where BioConnect plays?
Well, we do play in biometrics, but really we play in all of those spaces. So we're our current platform really, I view it as sort of almost an operating system for access control. We do have integrations into all of those points, but within biometrics specifically, we have the ability to connect up those systems, but also then create identities that span those. So we can integrate traditional biometric devices on the wall, we can integrate biometrics on mobile phones, and we can tie those capabilities in with traditional access control or with other systems that our customers bring into those data center facilities.
So the platform approach is really important because you have to basically be a core to integrate with all these partners and technologies and create kind of a seamless experience, going back to David's point about, customer experience really driving the retention and attracting customers.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to switch gears for just a minute and bring Kevin into the discussion, and kind of think about the physical infrastructure a bit. So in general, Kevin, you can look across industrial environments are kind of undergoing their own digital transformation, right? So how do you see kind of the increased convergence of, IT, OT, as well as IoT, which is a lot of acronyms in one sentence. But, how do those things combine and really create new challenges and opportunities for data security practice?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. If you go back, I really liked Dave's slides talking about it as a mesh network of different locations that you've got. And I think we're starting to view, with everything that happened with COVID, we're really, 2 years of progress was made in about 2 months. Like there's some lines that we like to use like that. But the reality is this, is I think we need to, not only do we have things sitting inside of colos and what's inside data center, I think we need to rethink what is our definition of a data center, because every point on that mesh network that Dave had in his slide starts becoming an access point for cyber threats and physical threats. So it's actually a much more complicated problem than just data center security. It's also about how do we, I mean, we know, for instance, on the cyber side, we've got data from our cloud that roughly 60% of customers are running outdated firmware. So we're trying to put in place, how do we get the right platform in place to allow them to keep those up to date? We know that a large percentage of customers have known vulnerabilities in terms of protocols enabled that they should not have, right? These are types of things where we need tools and how to be proactive, but not just inside the data center, but across the entire network. There's some data out there, by the way, that says we may have as many as 7 million edge locations in the future. Each of those is as mission critical as what we'd consider mission critical in data center. So we've got to think about this hybrid environment. And when you think about the edge locations, I mean, at least in the data center and most colos, Dave, I know you've been through some, and Courtney, I'm sure you have as well. I mean, you go in, you show them your license, you show them some of there's one colo who's famous for having an armed guard follow you around when you're inside the data center itself, okay? But then if I go to some of these edge locations, it might be the janitor who has the keys that can get access into the server room, and they can get onto the network as easily as you could if you were inside the data center. They can cause damage doing that. So I think we have to look much more comprehensively at this challenge. And for the CIO organization, the historic focuses have been, how do I ensure that my systems are resilient and available? And yes, Dave, I agree, they wanted to control everything, and now they've kind of lost control in some respects. So we're in this aspect, though, now that they got to get it back under control. I got to manage this hybrid environment. I need to be able to do it remotely. But now their concern is not only around resilient and available, but how is it cyber secure? And then also, how do I make sure I have the physical access as well? And how is that tied into the IT access that we allow people? So you're kind of getting this merger of, hey, who has access in the building to these different rooms coming from the building side? But that also needs to tie into what is the authentication on the IT side as well. So all of the technologies that BioConnect has really has an interesting role, and we haven't quite, as an ecosystem, knitted this all together yet. And I think that's really part of the challenge that, at least from where I sit and from what we do, we're really trying to figure out how do we create a better system so that you really can enable lights out management. To the example that Dave used earlier. So anyway, Maxine, I hope that gives a little bit of insight anyway.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're really focusing on when you think about sort of moving into the future, what's driving this, is sort of a more comprehensive approach today. And then going into the future, it sounds like it's wrapped around this understanding and securing this ecosystem, which seems to be kind of taking on a life of its own.
Well, yeah, and we view the ecosystem is quite broad because it also involves the IT players, right? In terms of what is, if I take an edge location, what is at that location? Most people do not even understand what they have in these edge locations. They may, Dave, I think you'd agree, traditionally, they may not even understand what's in their data centers in terms of the physical hardware, right? The zombie servers, which are so famous in our industry, where they're servers running that are actually doing nothing, but nobody was sure, so they never took them away. So this is a real problem. If you don't even know what you have, That's a
Right.
problem. And then who's getting access to it is a problem. And then how do I know it is all the firmware is up to date, it's cyber secure, I've done everything I can to prevent a cybersecurity hack, becomes a very big challenge. So how, again, creating the tools where you can do that remotely too, because we simply aren't going to have the staff to, again, not everybody's going to have an armed guard walking around inside of a retail store to make sure that only the right people have the right access. We've got to use technology in order to really address these new challenges that we're facing.
Interesting. So I want to open it up to everybody here a little bit. Couple of things that I keep hearing over and over again is this notion of control, which I think is fantastic, because as you were just saying, Kevin, when you have this massive ecosystem, you have, supposedly these secure facilities, but then you have all these uncontrolled edge points everywhere that you're trying to deal with. Where is the center of this? Who's going to drive this moving forward? Where is the solutions going to come from? And does a data center really have to own all of this and figure it out themselves? I mean, what does it look like in terms of how that evolves in the market with the players and the partners? And anybody who wants to jump in, feel free.
Well, I'll go first. I can tell you what we're doing is we are actually, when you take a look at the information that we have about the infrastructure, we've made a big investment about getting that data into the cloud and then having standardized APIs so that we can make that very readily and easily available to anybody who wants to integrate it. So it's much easier now than where we were even 3 years ago to get the data. And by the way, we're able to do analytics and machine learning and AI, all of that technology we can take, but through standardized APIs, make it available. And that allows the ecosystem to integrate this information much better. Maybe they don't want to use our platform, they have another platform, but they want some of the information from us. We've made a big investment in trying to make that much more standard than maybe where we were in the past. But I jumped on Dave, so.
That's all right. I think it's an interesting question. I mean, IT's realized they can't regain control over everything. Although what they can really do is create an environment that's flexible enough so when the business wants to do something new. I mean, think of it this way. I've got to design an infrastructure for a future that I don't know. I don't know what's going to look like next year or 2 years from now, the business. I mean, COVID proved that to all of us. So I've got to design infrastructure that's flexible enough that whatever business requirement pops up, I can satisfy it. So that, in fact, this idea of mesh networks or mesh environments, we're starting to get more and more customers talking about this idea that maybe I can define different mesh nodes or different, pieces of the puzzle based on workload types. So if I've got remote sites, say, to support retail, I may have a fairly consistent design point for a mini data center or a micro data center for those retail outlets. And those become individual nodes, and I can deploy them consistently across my ecosystem. And the real question becomes how do I allow access to it? Who gets access? That's centrally controlled. The workloads that are put on them, that's being developed by the business in many cases. But as long as they comply with essentially my mesh design, they can put any kind of workload they want. So IT controls, I guess, the deployment of the infrastructure, not necessarily the workloads themselves. Same thing with edge environments. We're seeing a lot of people now look at edge and saying, in fact, Kevin knows this. An edge environment might be a micro data center that's only a half a rack. It's got a couple of servers in it, but it's completely self-contained to the point where all its environmentals, all its power cooling, everything is controlled not by the local people. In fact, I could bolt it to a wall or put it in a back room so nobody can touch it, but it's still managed from centrally by IT. So the workload is solved. The workload problem and the latency problem is solved at the edge side. But as far as deployment control, that mesh piece is all controlled by IT itself. So it does become a more complex environment. And to Kevin's point, it also is an environment that I cannot hire people to support. I mean, it's getting more and more complex, and there's not resources out there I can hire unless I got one heck of a budget. So I've got to create environments that are very automated. I can deploy them easily. They're consistent, and I can manage them remotely.
Yeah, and I think that that consistency and speed and scale and security, you achieve that when you get rid of the friction, and a lot of that comes from ensuring that people aren't reinventing wheels, that they're not creating new independent solutions. Right, Kevin's spending a lot of time to make sure that you can create a standardized footprint physically to support that world. And, and we're, as much as we've federated and consolidated things in the software space, from our standpoint, we're working hard to do the same thing for access control as well, so that you can get those centralized controls and centralized monitoring, and remove those friction points that either stop people from deploying that mesh in the way that David's describing, or not create new problems for the organization around privacy and security and compliance while they're doing it.
Okay, so I want to again invite our audience to submit questions if they like to our panelists. I certainly could, I have lots more myself, but I'd love to have your questions as well. Another thing that comes up for me when just thinking about this, and this goes back to this idea of IT control, which maybe I'm obsessed with because I'm a bit of a control freak myself. What's the dynamic now between sort of IT and physical access security in terms of decision making? Who's controlling that? Who's making those decisions? What does that workflow look like when you have this sort of, I think what's becoming an increasingly blurred line between IT security and physical security. Anybody want to jump in on that one?
Just that anecdotally, from my perspective, at least the customers I talk to, traditionally, physical security was all around facilities team. IT got involved, but just peripherally. Now, especially post-COVID, well, are we post yet? Remote sites where I don't want anybody on site, where it's the idea of lights out data centers. It's interesting. The 40-year-old term on lights out is now popular again. But when an IT talks about lights out, the first thing they think about is access control and physical access control. And suddenly it's becoming an IT decision rather than a facilities decision. I guess the problem is, in most cases, if you're looking at deployments to remote sites that are controlled by somebody else, let's say a co-location facility, now you've got IT has to negotiate or work with the facilities teams and their building management systems to make sure that the access control works with what they've got in place and also works based on my requirements.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to take a lead from what we see happening on the cybersecurity side is, historically kind of the OT devices, say on a manufacturing floor, are controlled by the guys in charge of the manufacturing system. The building systems, as Dave was mentioned, were controlled by the facilities guys. What's happening, we're certainly seeing this, is as all these devices are coming onto the standard IT network, because years ago it was a proprietary network, for instance, for industrial process control. Those are all now coming onto the IT network. The challenge of cybersecurity is driving them towards the CIO organization, towards the IT guys. So all of a sudden, all this InfoSec requirements that they have on IT, well, those need to be adopted for the OT devices, because it can't just be a copy paste necessarily. So we're seeing the CIO is getting driven into this organization, driven into this conversation, is being forced to take responsibility, but there's a learning curve on both sides, right? And I think you see the same thing happening on the physical side. The physical access control this is all, in my opinion, and from what we're seeing, and as Dave just said, it is a new responsibility that the IT organizations are going to need to take on and embrace, because as everything comes onto the IT network, as everything starts becoming, it becomes exposed. And as it becomes exposed, it's got to be integrated in with a system that you can audit and track and see what was happening. So I don't think the answer is clear yet. I can tell you our view is it's moving towards the IT organizations, and they're going to need to embrace it and understand how to do it. But again, that's a lot of people change as well. And as we know, the organizational change of facilities embracing that, and different organizations. Within Schneider, we created a separate organization within the CIO in order to deal with the factories, for instance. I mean, there's perhaps new organizational constructs that companies need to think about as well.
So I've got a live participant question here. Knowing user experience is so important to the colo space, how can merging IT and physical security benefit the customer experience? So that's looking at it from a slightly different perspective. Courtney, you want to jump in on that one?
Sure, I've become quite passionate about that one. What excites me most about the ability to create new customer value from that merging really comes from the tools. And I think access control has often been a one-way flow. You tap your card, you get through the door. what we've been seeing as we've moved mobile into and other IT tools into the physical access conversation, in the data center space specifically, we've been able to come up with, I think, really interesting solutions that before you open a cabinet, you are prompted to provide a reason why you're going in there and how long you're going to go in there. And the ability to create audit log records out of access events that help with your compliance, the ability to even just prompt users if they were going to be there for 45 minutes and an hour later the back door to the cab is still open, you can send an alert and say, did you forget to close the back of the cabinet? From a security standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, I think there's really interesting solutions that come out of creating a two-way conversation with the users of your facility through these new tools.
Interesting. Okay, here's another question. This one I think will be for Kevin. How do you reduce infrastructure technical debt and balance cost with investment?
Well, if I knew the answer to that, I would start a business and probably be, in a different. What we're seeing people do is we're seeing customers is the question is, where's your biggest problem is the first question, right? Is where am I the least secure? Where do I have the most technical debt? What is my worst closet that I need to clean up? Or where do I start is probably the biggest question. So we've been building in to some of our systems assessment tools that just help you assess what's out there, how old is stuff, or some of these devices behaving poorly and maybe they're antiquated. Just how do I actually just kind of analyze where I am? And it usually emerges to be pretty clear about where do you start. And generally we also see is that those get tied to IT refresh cycles. So again, it's rare, I would say, that you'd see someone go and just update the physical infrastructure if there was no IT change happening at the same time. So the process that we see that I think most people are coming out with is, first of all, assess where I have my biggest problems and is there something critical that I need to address right now, and then go address those. And then the second thing is, how do I start a planning cycle so that perhaps the next time somebody's out there because they got to, upgrade something, how do I package together as much work as possible? So if somebody has to get deployed, if we're going to update IT, hey, maybe I can update the physical infrastructure as well and do some additional things. So how do I get a better planning and process in place? But again, I'll come back to it. We really have to get oriented around, addressing the technical debt most of the time is being driven by the IT cycle. So if there's IT technical debt, that's going to be the impetus to really drive the infrastructure. And then how do I get a modernization plan and an assessment and a plan about what I need to do when I decide to go touch that. So I hope that's clear. Hope that if I understood the question. So
that's great. Here's another question from our audience. What changes to the access control world were created during COVID are each of you most excited about?
What changes?
What changes to the access control were created during COVID that each of you are most excited about? Is there,
I can give you, I'll answer the question maybe a little different way, and then I'll let Dave ponder and come back with a more adult answer perhaps. But and we've talked to, I did a series of interviews with people in the industry, one of whom was Julia White at Microsoft. And what became clear is what got stressed during COVID was basically this concept of the edge. Okay. I mean, obviously, everybody went and worked from home. So all of a sudden your mini wiring closet everybody has in their house became mission critical, right? So the importance of the mesh network, as Dave highlighted, which I just think it was a great image he put together, that every point along that line becomes mission critical. Even if there's no compute, if you just have networking closets that are connecting people, if those go down, then really work came to a stop. And so for us, that was quite interesting. We experienced that where there was acceleration in certain parts of our business that were quite surprising when COVID hit. And so all of these issues, it really accelerated and focused, not just about access control, but the need to be thinking about the entire complexity of your hybrid environment, and that things that you used to ignore, server rooms, wiring closets, now, as Dave was saying, you need to think of as little micro data centers, and you need to manage them in a similar way. You need to have visibility, control over a similar way that you do in your data center. So that's not specific to physical access control, but I think certainly the COVID experience drove a greater awareness of, hey, I'm really dependent on these little wiring closets out there, and if something goes wrong, what do I do? So
Yeah, and it's Dave. I'll tie into that same idea. I mean, I one of the more interesting things that I heard from a lot of customers was uh, it was interesting. It was almost like their eyes opened up. I mean, they looked at COVID and they said, okay, we've been in colo for years. We used to sign a contract for hands and feet services. They do installs and deinstalls. They do updates to my my OS and patches and fixes. But all they paid for was hours of work, and who did the work was irrelevant to them. And COVID, suddenly they started to say, who's getting into that cage? Who's doing that work? Is there any kind of audit trail of when they've been tested, or what else they've had access to it? So I guess it's not access control so much as is the need for a much more understanding of who has access, who's actually doing the work, rather than just the fact that somebody is. So I guess my customers, at least, they've opened their eyes to say, I'm just not going to trust that it's being done by somebody that's the right person. I want to actually know who's doing this, and consistently know who's doing it across the board.
So that's a perfect tie into our next question, which is how important will biometrics and identity authentication be in data center access? So I'll give that one to you, Courtney.
Sure, and I think I think it'll continue to be highly important, and it's and I think even the notion of I think biometrics in a number of forms reduce friction and and increase identity assurance and get people in faster and more securely into places, which is important when people come to data centers. Is often for urgent reasons. But I think even the identity assurance side of it, to tag on to what David was just saying, I think those changing systems become even more important because it's not just increased scrutiny on who are you, but how are you as well, and where are you? And I think as those conversations become more complex around everything from COVID status to compliance checks to dealing with populations that are much more mobile, I think the complexity of that problem becomes higher, and the technology that we need to be able to bring to it becomes a lot more meaningful as well. So I think it's going to continue to grow.
All right, so we unfortunately have to wrap up. I could talk to you guys for another hour easily. So I just want to just ask each of you quickly, just a thought or a word or a sentence of, what do you think the most important thing for our audience to take away from this conversation is today? I'll start with David.
Probably consistent access, consistent design, consistent. If the future of infrastructure is everywhere, I need to understand that I'm deploying a consistent methodology across the board. I can't gain control from the customers. They're going to do what they want, but if I can give guardrails, help define to them, and get them to follow those guardrails, then life is going to be much easier going forward.
Okay. Courtney?
I think from my standpoint, it's the learnings from the last year and a bit on the need for flexibility and better integration of systems to get the roadblocks out of changing needs and get the roadblocks out of the growth that we want to see in the systems. It's for me, I want to see people continue to push into systems that accelerate tech adoption and get the right tools in to do that.
And Kevin, last word.
Mute.
Kevin, I think you're muted. Are you muted?
Oh, am I back now?
There you go. Now we have you.
Oh.
We have one technical snafu, or it wouldn't be a virtual event.
It wouldn't be Zoom. I guess the important thing I would say from our standpoint is, how do customers, you got to start putting together a strategy about how you're going to attack this, because what's clear right now is that in Dave's point, well taken about consistency and everything, but you got to start somewhere. How do you go out and assess where you are today, and then put together a plan on how you're going to get there? I can tell you within Schneider, as a result of COVID, we've identified now, our CIO, who I'm work with on this, is we have 700 server rooms across the company, and they all need to be upgraded. So we're working with them on how do you put together a strategy and a plan to address that. and how do you go step by step to get there? And it needs to be a very strategic type conversation. You're not going to be able to do it overnight. It's going to be a journey. And what are the key tools? Because you need that I want to maintain resiliency. So what do I need to put in place to get the level of resiliency I need in each of these nodes of my mesh network? And then how do I get the right security profile in place, both not only from cyber, which everybody is focused on, but also from a physical access as well. And that all of those are important. It's not like one's more important than another. They're all important, and you need to have a plan and then start working against that, because it might take some time. It won't happen overnight. So I don't know. Those are the thoughts.
Well, thanks, Kevin. And I have to thank you for that, because as a strategic marketeer myself, planning is critical. And that's always, well, I always talk to folks who are ready to jump into execution. And I'm like, you have to have a plan before you execute, or execution is not going to go very well. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you taking time with us today. I want to thank our host again, BioConnect, and our sponsors, HID, ASSA ABLOY, and Gartner. And also, I'd really like to thank the audience for hanging with us today. I thought it was fascinating. I certainly learned a lot. Just a reminder, again, look out for that BioConnect ebook on modern access control in your follow-up email. And I really appreciate everyone taking the time today. Have a great day, and we'll